story is told of an orphanage back east where there was a little girl. This little girl was evidently somewhat of a problem child. It seems like nobody liked her. None of the kids had anything to do with her. Even the counselors didn't like her very well. They avoided her. They would draw straws, and the loser would have to counsel with her. She was just a problem child. Didn't seem to ever be happy. Seemed to have a lot of problems. Even the director, and she was a compassionate lady, she just didn't like the child, and she finally was convinced that this child needed more help than the orphanage could give. And so she was giving serious thought one afternoon to committing the child to some sort of mental institution so that she could perhaps get help there that she couldn't get in the orphanage. During that session, when she was debating that decision, one of the kids came in running and panting from running so hard and called her out and mentioned to her, she says, I was watching, and she mentioned the little girl's name. She says, I was watching her, and she has been writing notes and hanging them on the tree out in the yard. And this poor director thought, oh no, what's going on now? This is just the next incident in a long string of them. So she said, okay, we'll go out and take a look. So she went out into the yard. She found the tree, and sure enough, on the lower branches of the tree, there were all kinds of little white notes hanging with strings. And she just shuddered to think at what this troubled child might have written and hung up in that tree for people to read. She went up, she pulled one of the notes down, and she opened it up, and as she looked at it, she read these words: "Whoever finds this, I love you." And perhaps for the first time in that child's life, somebody began to understand her problem. She was somebody who was touched by the impersonal world in which we live, and somebody who was crying out for some love. When Paul lists the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5, those things that are generated by the presence of the Spirit of God in our lives, Paul says that the first fruit of the Spirit of God is love. Now you can go to any number of places in the New Testament and read the word love found in a series of things that a Christian ought to make a part of their lives. For instance, in 2 Peter, Peter lists those things that we should add to our lives. He says, add unto your faith virtue, and unto your virtue knowledge, and unto your knowledge temperance, and on down. And the last thing he mentions is that we should add to our lives brotherly love. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13 that of all the gifts that the Spirit of God has yielded to the church in the first century, both miraculous and non-miraculous, there are three that stand above the rest: faith, hope, and love. And in the words of the apostle himself, the greatest of these is love. In writing to the young preacher Timothy, Paul urges him on by saying, don't let men despise your youthfulness, but be an example to the believers in, and then that list again, he gives a series of things: faith, joy, peace, and among them is listed love. It just seems to be a consistent brick in the building of God. If I'm going to be a Christian, if I'm going to serve the Lord the way the Lord would have me, I'm going to have to somehow get a handle on this thing that God calls love. I'm going to have to somehow try to incorporate the concept of love into my life. Now, I'm not going to give you a long lecture this morning about what love is and what love is not. We all know the problem in our society about distinguishing, I love pizza. Now, that's not the kind of love that God talks about. That just means I really like it, and if you're like me and had a light breakfast this morning, you'd sure like to have one right now. And I'm going to make you stay here for another hour or two and wait so that you won't get your pizza that soon. I love pizza. I love the Lakers. Somebody says that. Lakers are playing today. And so, I love the Lakers. Well, you may love the Lakers, but that's not the kind of love that put Jesus on the cross. You see, the kind of love that God talks about and the kind of love that's found in all of these lists of characteristics of Christians, the fruit of the Spirit and things like that, is a kind of love that is different from the way we use the word today. It's not a sexual kind of attraction. It's not even a It's not even really a question of liking or disliking. It isn't a matter of, I like pizza and I don't like hot chili. See, there's a difference there. This I like and this I don't. It's a matter of preference. Genuine love in the Bible has no sense of preference. And maybe that's what makes the difference in our life. And frankly, it's something I think all of us struggle with in adding to our lives. I was sitting back thinking this week as I was going over thoughts for the lesson, how do you apply this lesson to people's lives? And I was asking myself, do I practice love consistently in my life? And I started thinking about a number of examples that I would love to just lay on people. You need to do this and you need to do that and you people need to practice this. And I started finding myself in self-condemnation because I think none of us practice the highest of the gifts to perfection. And so it's a challenge to all of us. And many of us, frankly, have not begun to touch the hem of the garment in terms of understanding and practicing the kind of love that God talks about. I love the passage in Romans that was read for us this morning. It just says so much. Let no debt remain outstanding. We've used that for years, and I think rightly so, to say that the Bible teaches that a Christian pays his debts, and I believe that. The Bible teaches that Christians are people of integrity. If they make a bill, they pay the bill. If they run up a debt, they pay their debt. At the same time, Paul says, leave no debt outstanding except the ongoing debt to love one another. He says that in a sense, I owe it to others to love them. Now, that's a strange thing for me because generally we assume that love is something that is earned, not something that is owed. And so really, Paul puts what I call a flip side interpretation on it. He takes the standard of the world that says, I will love you if you deserve it, and turns it over to the other side and says, no, I have a debt to love my brothers. It's an obligation on my part. It has nothing to do with him. He says the commandments, don't commit adultery, murder, or steal, don't covet. Whatever commandments there might be, he says, you can sum them up in one rule, love your neighbor as yourself, and if you think about it, that's true. I wonder how many marriages would be saved from hours and years of counseling. I wonder how many marriages would become the right kind of relationship between husband and wife if we would simply have no debt outstanding other than that debt which is ongoing, and that is to love one another. We come to church and we meet some old brother and he's a cantankerous old cuss and we don't really get along with him well. We don't halfway like his personality, but he is a brother and we are at church, and so we treat him kindly and respectfully. And then we go home and we walk in the door and there's another cantankerous old cuss that's just about as hard to get along with, but we don't treat him the same way, do we? You see, there's an inconsistent application there. What is this love all about? John says it again in 1 John 4, says it quite well. In 1 John 4, verses 7 to 12, we have these words, Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, and God, because God, he says, is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love. Not that we loved God. And you see, here's that other side again. It's not that love is something that is earned. It's that love is something that is owed to others by us. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. And he goes on and talks about some other things. There's really a great deal that's said about love in 1 John, and we'll notice a couple of those things. But what about love? I don't want to talk so much this morning about God's love for us and the love of Christ for us on the cross. I think we all accept that and understand it. But how do I respond to it? How do I add love to my life? How can it manifest itself in a way that I can see and that others can experience so that men will know that I'm a child of God? So that men can read the book of my life, or if we use the words of Paul in Galatians 5, so that men can inspect the fruit on my tree and know from that fruit that I bear that which comes from the Spirit of God. Number one, love is staying with people through hard times. I think you could begin by illustrating from God's own relationship with man and how many times God was forbearing with his people. I always think of the children of Israel in the wilderness. And I think of the great expression of love that Moses made on that one occasion when God comes to Moses in kind of a burning rage. And he says to Moses, he says, I want you just to pick up your family and pack up your belongings, and I want you just to move over there and get up on the hillside and watch what I'm going to do to these gripey people. I'm going to just, you watch, I'm going to raise my hand and I'm going to just shaboom, and I'm going to blow them clear off the face of the earth, and there's not going to be any of them left. And then, Moses, I'll just take you and your family and I'll make a better nation than them out of you. And you know that's a tempting thing. I think my first inclination would be to say, great, I knew I had something the rest of them didn't. You're right. I got the right stuff. You just get me started and we'll get this whole thing straightened out. We'd all like to think that we're right and everybody else is wrong, don't we? But Moses looked at the Lord and he says, now, Lord, these are your people. These are your children. You've nurtured them and raised them and made a covenant with them, and you have a reputation to uphold. And Lord, it just wouldn't be right to destroy all of them. And so the Lord recanted at this expression of love on the part of Moses. And I think that's all you can call it. His love and compassion. I think of how many times they tested God in the wilderness, and how many times the Lord must have been tried much more than we ever are in our human relationships. And yet I think of how the Lord consistently, or perhaps we should say persistently, stood by his people even in hard times. I look at John 13, verse 1, very important passage. It's the section where Jesus demonstrates his humility by washing the feet of his disciples. This is a very trying time in the life of Jesus, isn't it? He's really under the gun. He's about to endure the Last Supper with the disciples, knowing that he's eating that last meal and instituting his new meal with one who is about to betray him, and with 11 others, or at least 10 others, who are on the verge of denying him. And in the mind of God, through his ability to understand the history of things, he knows that's going to happen. He even announces it, doesn't he, at the supper? He looks around and he says, now there's one of you here who's going to betray me. He comes to that meal knowing that on the heels of that meal he's going to the garden, and there he's going to sweat blood and struggle with the future of humanity, and after that he's going to be taken prisoner and beaten and scourged and placed on the cross, and he knows all of this is coming up. And I wonder sometimes the tremendous emotional strains that must be pulling inside of him at this point in time. The Bible says in John 13, verse 1, it was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father, and having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. You know, it's hard to love people when times are hard. We all know that experience, those times in life when the finances aren't what they should be, or when other problems at work or at home are eating away at your family relationships, and the words get sharp and the tempers get short, and somehow that nebulous, vague thing that we call love is no longer there, and we just kind of let it slip out the door. And yet the Bible teaches us that in the hard times are those times when love really shows itself to be the genuine thing. I look again to James chapter 2 and verse 8. James says, if you really keep the royal law found in the Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, and that's from the Old Testament, by the way, not the New, Leviticus 19, verse 18, you are doing right, for if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law. Now that's an interesting passage, because there, James looks at a situation where you have a congregation and you have a rich and poor problem, and the poor come into the congregation, and the rich in the congregation just don't quite like them too well. And so you begin to show favoritism. And of course you have the flip side of it, and you find that in the Gospels as well, where the poor begin to resent the rich. Good example of that in commentary terms is the book of 1 Corinthians, where you have as much resentment by the poor toward the rich as you do the rich toward the poor. Now you can, somebody says, well, thank goodness that doesn't apply to us. Most of us are middle-class Americans, and so we can just kind of go along, and that's fine. But I'm not sure that's true. Prejudice raises its ugly head in a lot of different forms. Sometimes it's an age prejudice. You know, oh, you're too young. You know, everybody knows all young people are dumb. Of course, you know, 40% of our population is under 25. So 40% of our nation depends on them dumb people. You know, we always tend to think everybody else is bad. We all, you know, old people, they're just, you know how strange they are. They're all that way. Don't you hate to be categorized? Don't you just hate that? Growing up as a kid, I always used to hate that. Grew up in the middle 60s, you know, late 60s, the hippies and all that kind of stuff. And I remember in college we were told you couldn't wear a pink shirt because, you know, only certain kinds of people wore pink shirts. And you couldn't grow hair down so far on your face because only hippies wore that. And everybody knows about hippies. And I always thought, I didn't know Abraham Lincoln was a hippie. You know, because he had hair on his face and he didn't strike me as being that eccentric. You see, we like to categorize people, don't we? And we all do it. There's that religious group over there. Well, we all know what they think, don't we? Well, probably not. Probably not. And so prejudice takes a lot of different forms. Oh, well, I don't like his kids, and so I don't like him either. Or his wife acts a little strange, and so I don't like them. I think the greatest form of prejudice we practice in the church is our ostracism of strangers. If they haven't been around a long time, we don't know them real well, then they're cut off. And that's tragic, isn't it? And perhaps these are areas where love needs to find its expression, where we need to open our hearts and our eyes to what's around us, where, as the Bible teaches, we ought to outdo each other in giving honor to one another, and not worry so much about our nice little self-contained worlds that make us feel very secure, but that don't put our faith out on the cutting line. The story is told of Alexander the great world conqueror, a young man who at 23 owned the civilized world. It's said that, and of course this is typical of Alexander, he was not only a great general, but also a tremendous egotist. He decided to have an oil painting done of himself in a day and time when oil paintings were quite rare. He had them send in and bring in from Athens one of the great oil painters of the time. And as they sat together, they began talking about how they wanted to do the painting, and they decided that they wanted to do Alexander's face in profile. And so Alexander presented his profile, and as the painter began to look, he noticed one problem. In the course of one of his battles, Alexander had received a sword to the side of his face. And up the side of his cheek, there was a very open, ugly, gaping scar on the side of his face they wanted to paint. And the painter looked at that, and it became a real problem, because obviously Alexander wanted this side painted, and yet it wouldn't be very complimentary to paint this very handsome young man with this grotesque scar down his face. And so as the story goes, the man decides to work with him, and so he puts him up to the table and has him put his arm up and cup his chin on his hand, something like this. And then he worked with him a little bit in a very subtle, kind way. You don't tell the emperor of the world that his face is ugly and let's cover it up. So he gradually worked him around to where he put a couple of fingers up the side of his face, just enough to cover the scar, and then he did a beautiful oil painting of Alexander's profile. Now that illustrates in a beautiful way the way God looks at my life and yours. God sees the ugliness. He cannot miss it. Being a holy God, He knows it's there. And all of us, in a sense, present scarred profiles to God. And yet it is the nature of God to somehow, in the kindest of ways, cover the ugliness so that He can present us in a picture of beauty to Himself. Now, if we could simply relate to that and translate it in terms of the way we act toward others. When times get hard, we tend to magnify faults, don't we? Things that never bothered us before are all of a sudden crises. Little things that at one time were overlooked become focal points for division and unhappiness in our homes, in our friendships, in our churches. Why, like the painter of Alexander, can we not learn to simply move a couple of fingers over the scar and go on? And so love stays through the hard times. Love, if you please, toughs it out. Number 2, love is taking human needs seriously. You know, that may sound kind of silly. We could look up and say, well, our church takes the position that benevolence is important. You know, that doesn't mean anything. Church positions don't mean a whole lot. Not really. You know, because what good does my church position mean if I don't practice it? I talked to a fellow the other day. He's a member of a very large church, and I asked him, I said, well, you know that your church teaches this. Yes. Do you agree with that? No, sure don't. Well, how about this? Do you agree with this? Well, not really. Well, what about that? And I was naming 4 or 5 of the main doctrines of that church. Do you agree with that? Well, not at all. How about this? Oh, I can't stand that. Well, what about this? No, that's silly. I said, well, how can you call yourself a member of this church? You don't believe anything it teaches. You're not a member of that church. I don't know what you're a member of, but it's not that group. You don't believe in anything that group believes in. And it's what they believe in that makes them that. You know, and it just didn't make sense to me. And I wonder how many times my friends and neighbors around me look at my life and say, you know, he doesn't really believe that. He says it, but he doesn't believe it. Love takes human needs seriously. John says in 1 John 3, verses 16 to 18, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Now, if that's not addressing human need, what is? What is the ultimate human need? Salvation? Freedom from sin? Freedom from the clutches of death and the fear of no resurrection? Isn't that the ultimate human need? And God says, if you want to know what love is, there it is. Visible expression. Something you can put your hands on and get a hold of. Christ died for our sins. But he doesn't leave it at that. You know, so we believe in the atonement. That's great. Now we've got another doctrine, but what do you do with it? What does the atonement imply in my life? Let's say I accept the blood of Christ and make it a part of my life through obeying the gospel. Let's say I drink the Lord into my life and make him my Savior. So what? So is that where it ends? Am I now okay? What about the implications? And we, he says, ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. And I have an idea that in the context of 1 John, we should read that literally. I don't think he's saying, as we like to think so many times, that we should love our brethren enough that if they need some help, we'll help them out. Sure, that's implied. I think John's going much further. I think John's literally talking about a church under persecution. And he's saying, look, if Christ died for you and it's necessary for you to die for your brother, you do it. That's love. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? James conjures up a situation where a brother walks up and he sees this fellow and he says, are you hungry? And the fellow says, I'm starving. And the fellow looks at him and he says, well, I sure hope you find something to eat, and God bless you. And he walks away. Goes up to McDonald's and buys himself a hamburger. I'll never forget an impression that was made on me when I was 10 or 11 years old. My mom and I we'd gone down to see the Reds play baseball at Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati. We went over across the river into Covington, Kentucky. In northern Kentucky, there are a chain of hamburger places called White Castle. Has anybody here ever heard of White Castle hamburgers? Yeah, you see, there's a few normal people in this world. Those things are great. I mean, when God invented hamburgers, he invented White Castle hamburgers. That's just the kind he started with, and all the rest of them kind of degenerated down from there. Well, we went down into Covington to get a White Castle hamburger, and I'll never forget the impression as we came out of that little hamburger place. It was on one of the little back streets. And there was this old gentleman. He was obviously an indigent, a Skid Row personality coming out of there. And I saw that old gentleman, and Mom and I watched as he came in and he sat down at that table and he had just enough money to buy him a small Coke and one hamburger. And this is with a 12-year-old kid that can knock down 5 or 6 just like that. And I looked at that and it really bothered me. And I asked my mom about it. I said, Mom, why are people that way? And we had a long talk after that about people having need and about how you respond to that kind of need. We went over, by the way, and gave him $1. and told him to go buy, at that time, 4 more. You could get them for 25 cents a piece. It just didn't seem right that he should do without while I was over there stuffing my face, you know. And yet so many times we fail to respond to need. Somebody says, well, that's not true. You know, we take up collections and we give, and that's true. And we have a marvelous benevolent program here. But what about other kinds of need? What about emotional need? What about the little girl that hung the signs hung the little pieces of paper on the tree that said, if anyone finds this, I love you? You know, what good does it do to fill a man's belly and leave his heart empty? What good does it do to give him the finest clothes you have and leave his soul bankrupt? You know, there are so many areas. Responding to human need, there's a story that's told of 2 brothers. One was single, one was married and had a family. They lived on adjoining farms. And it so happened that in a certain year, the wheat crop didn't make as well as they expected it to, and they were both raising wheat, so they had a real problem. One night, they were both lying in bed in their separate houses. The married man was lying there next to his wife with his kids in the next room, and he started thinking to himself, you know, my brother's over there all by himself, and he's all alone, and he's had a poor crop this year, and I'll bet you he's really depressed, and he probably could use some encouragement, and besides that, I'm sure he needs some extra wheat to eat this year, so, you know, I'm going to get up and I'm going to go take him some right now. And at the same time, a single brother was over in his house, sleeping in his bed by himself, and he started thinking to himself, you know, my brother's over there, he's got a wife and 3 kids to feed. He's had a bad crop this year, and they probably don't have enough to eat. And you know, the right thing to do would be for me to go get some wheat and to take it over to him and just offer it to him, because I don't need that much. The interesting thing was what happened when they both were sneaking across the field that night. It was cloudy. And right in the middle of the stealth across the field, as they were about to pass one another unbeknownst to each other, the clouds moved away and a full moon shone, and there were the 2 brothers standing looking at each other with their bags of wheat in their hands, both going to help the other. I wonder how many times life would be made better if, as Christians, we found ourselves meeting in the middle of the field, knowing that you're coming to help me and I'm coming to help you. So many times it's easy to be a giver. You know, there's 2 sides to that. Somebody says, well, the world's full of takers. There just seems to be somebody always wanting this and always, and that's true. But you know, the world is full of givers too, and that's not entirely good either. Somebody says, well, that's heresy. Christians are givers, and that's not really true. Christians are givers and takers. We need to learn to let other people meet us in the field, carrying things to us the way we carry to them. Because it's in that mutual flowing back and forth that our love is made rich toward one another. Number 3, love is staying faithful to God, and the passages are many. John 14, verses 15, 21, and 23 all say, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. I like the passage in 2 Corinthians 5, verses 14 and 15. Marvelous book, 2 Corinthians. We ought to study it more often. 2 Corinthians 5, 14 and 15, listen to this. For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. Paul says the love of Christ compels me to commit myself to the death of Christ in my life. He says I can't follow anybody but Christ because his love on the cross has become a motivational force in my life. I'm going to serve Jesus. I'm going to give my life to the Lord. I'm going to serve him every day of my life. When the saints meet, I'm going to meet. When the brethren pray, I'm going to pray. When the brethren sing, I'm going to sing. When we study together. When we work together. Why? Because that's what the Lord wants. I think the biggest problem I have in my life is letting myself get in the way of the Lord. You ever have that problem? Probably a couple of us do. We always blame external circumstances, don't we? Well, I didn't do that because of time, or because of work, or because of this, or because of something else. And we always have a reason for why we're not quite as faithful to the Lord as we really know deep down inside the Lord wants us to be. God says that the love of the Lord can cut through all of that malarkey and can begin to speak to our lives in genuine terms. And when I really strip the veneer away and look at my life, really, when I'm not as faithful as I should be, the reason is because I've gotten in God's way. It isn't that my wife or my kids or my work or my neighbors or some guy I've never met or a political decision or a law in Congress or anything else has anything to do with it. Because ultimately I'm one-on-one with God, and it's my relationship with Him, and it's either my will or His. And that's what the Bible says, because Jesus says, if any man would be my disciple, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. He says, you deny yourself and take up your cross, and the rest of it's simple. It's getting around myself that causes the problem. The last thing is that love seeks the unity of God's people. 1 Corinthians 13, isn't that a romantic passage? Don't you just love that? Everybody wants to read 1 Corinthians 13 at their wedding. Have you ever studied the context of 1 Corinthians 13? Maybe it ought to be read at more weddings in view of the context. Paul's writing to a church that is just absolutely torn apart in every imaginable direction. They're torn apart morally, they're torn apart doctrinally, they're torn apart in worship, they're torn apart theologically, they're torn apart intellectually, they're torn apart socially. I mean, these people don't get along. You know, they'd make the Hatfields and McCoys look like tame folks. And they come together every Sunday, and Paul says when they come together, it's a waste of their time because everybody is sent away feeling bad instead of good. And right in the midst of that whole discussion about the things that are dividing that church, Paul says, now, let me tell you what really matters. No, they were into the spiritual gifts. They had tongue speaking, and they had prophecy, and they had all these other things. And they were all getting up, and they'd even fight with each other over that. One fellow would want to do his, and another fellow would want to do his, and they get in an argument over who goes first. And Paul finally says, fine. Have those gifts of the Spirit. God gave them, and that's fine. Use them the way they should. But let me tell you about a gift that's far greater than any of those silly things. Let me show unto you the most excellent way. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, it profits me nothing. He talks about knowledge, plumbing the depths of the mysteries of God, faith that jerks a mountain up and casts it away. Faith, knowledge, tongues, prophecy, have it all. Exercise it all. If you have no love, you're empty. He says your tongues sound to God like a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. And in Greek, it probably would be best translated as a rattling garbage can lid. You ever had your kids go out and bang garbage can lids together? That's one of the 3 reasons I know for stoning to death. Get out there and line those things up and throw balls at them and try to knock them over. People are crazy, you know. It's my wife's kids that do that kind of stuff, you know. Paul says love, and this is the key. This is the key to the whole thing here, and it's what Paul says when he says that love is the fulfillment of all the law. Love builds relationships. Love builds relationships. Now that means that love says something to what I say about people. Love says something to the way I treat people. Love says something to the attitudes I have toward people, or sometimes don't have toward people. Love changes relationships. If you don't believe it, look at the cross and the love of the cross and ask yourself if that didn't change God's relationship with the whole human race. Love changes relationships. Well, the lesson's yours. Listen to this. Prayer for daily life. Make this your prayer, live it in your life, and you'll be a long way toward making love a fruit of the Spirit in your life. God, let me find the lonely ones among the throng today, and let me say the word to take the loneliness away. So many walk with aching hearts along the old highway. So many walk with breaking hearts, and no one understands. They find the roadway rough and steep across the barren lands. God, help me lighten weary eyes and strengthen nerveless hands. God, help me brighten dreary eyes, and let my own grief be a sure reminder of the grief of those who walk with me. When words fail, hands fail, let me go in silent sympathy. Love cares. Somebody once said, "How much does God love me?" And Jesus raised his arms and said, "This much." When I can learn to love this much, I'm perfect. But I must confess, my cross sometimes feels a bit high. And the nails hurt a bit too much. And the back is a little too sore. And the thirst is a little too deep. And so it's easier to not love. Paul said, "So now abides faith, hope, and love, these three. The greatest of these is love." Do you love God today enough to become a Christian? Enough to come in faith? Enough to repent of sins? Enough to confess your faith in Him as your Lord? Enough to obey His will and being buried with Him in baptism, raised to walk in newness of life? Enough to take up the challenge of the Christian life and to try to walk with God? Enough to begin appropriating the love of the cross in your own life? If not, if you haven't become a Christian, we encourage you to let your love respond right now while we stand and sing. Would you live for Jesus and beyond?